What's up, guys? Happy Thursday Night Football. I'm Alex Baker, joined today by Kyle Dvorchak. We're with Awesemo.com, sponsor of the show, no house advantage, but we got a huge football game between two of the titans of the NFL, the Browns and the Bengals. Kyle, how are you feeling about tonight's game, man?
I mean, it's an interesting slate. I don't know if it's actually interesting football, but it's going to be. I think it'll be a good slate. I think there are a lot of really interesting decision points. Like the running backs on the Browns, for instance, just make a dynamic that not many other teams have. So there's a lot of fun decisions to make. I don't know if that means I want to watch it though.
Yeah, I think that Chubb Kareem Hunt situation is pretty interesting. One of the interesting things about tonight's game, I think there's more deep sleepers than maybe we're used to.
So many.
That'll be fun to break down. A lot of guys we haven't really seen win people money in DFS before, but maybe tonight it could be the night. But let's start just quickly reviewing the past few showdown slates. We've had 3 so far. Kyle, I know you're writing about it in your articles on the site.
Mm-hmm.
What have you seen so far?
So the biggest thing I've noticed is that 2-4 lineups have done better than I've thought. And I don't know if it's obviously it's a small sample, but I do think that's interesting that could be a lineup build that is at least, it doesn't hit often, but it's probably a lineup build that no one is really going to. So I think just playing on that end, and then obviously I think we've talked about it a few times on the showdown shows I've been on, that 5-1 is a lineup that people don't tend to go to very often, and it hits at a higher rate than people go to it. So 2-4 though kind of has surprised me at how successful it's been in a handful of showdown slates we've had.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about the industry is like people have figured out 5-1 is kind of a good strategy, and that makes a lot of sense because like there's a good amount of football games where one team just really doesn't do much, the other team gets the ball back and has most of the plays, but 4-2, I mean, even just like not stacking at all, not worrying about that, or just focusing on the player correlations. It's like all in play. That's why like there's so many interesting decisions, as you were saying, especially if you're trying to win one of these big tournaments on DraftKings or FanDuel, because if you want to win a big prize, you got to come up with something unique. So has that been a focus of yours to really try to make a lineup that's not going to be owned too many times?
Yeah, I think that is probably the next frontier, is just finding ways to create lineups that you don't enter the slate just like completely drawing dead, that even if you finish first, your expected value is chopped so hard. Because I think people generally, like, everyone has good projections, even ownership projections are solid, but leveraging those in a way that's unique is probably the most important frontier in DFS right now.
Definitely, yeah. I think a lot of us are looking at similar projections. Mine are actually free on the site today, so make sure to check those out. But even like if people aren't using projections, like everyone knows, like Odell Beckham Jr. is like the wide receiver 1 on the Browns, and he's going to be one of the top targets. And Joe Mixon's like the Bengals go-to guy, and it's like there's really not that many mistakes you can make on a 1-game slate compared to like a 12-game slate or something. So I think it does even the playing field a lot. Guys, before we really jump into this game here, me and Kyle were very sensitive. We rely a lot on positive feedback to give good takes. Make sure to click that like button so that you get the best plays for tonight's game. Appreciate it. Let's get to a few hundred here. All right, so let's talk about the captain / MVP, depending on DraftKings or FanDuel tonight. Is there any one player that's standing out as maybe a guy you want to start off your lineup with?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that we could see people shy away from playing either Browns running back and captain because the split has it's decision paralysis, indecision by not making a decision. So for me, I would be considering making a guy like Nick Chubb a priority in captain spot, given that the Browns are big favorites. So I think that's a guy I'd look to. And then I think the receivers for me, maybe this is a spot you go quarterback, though. Quarterbacks are cheap as well in the slate relative to everything else. And there's so much value right now. We're going to talk about some cheap guys. So I think you can afford to pay up. So that's probably where I'd be looking. I think I'd start with the running backs because I think we could see people shying away from making that decision.
Definitely, yeah. I think that Cleveland was really surprising on Sunday because Nick Chubb last year was obviously their go-to guy, but then Kareem Hunt came off of his suspension, I think, and he kind of had an interesting role on the team where he was running around a lot of routes while Chubb was on the field. But last game, it really seemed like they stopped doing that. It was mostly just one or the other on this field at once. I know you wrote about that in your article too. I think you mentioned, was it about like 4 times in the whole game they played on the same time?
Chubb and Hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I think it was 5 snaps they ran 2 running backs, but they were not, it was a fullback every time. They didn't take the field together once.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, my bad for misquoting you there.
No, you're
So
good.
like
You're
they
good.
had two backs 5 times. It wasn't like
But it was
Chubb
never the same. Yeah.
and Hunt. So that, like, going into the season, we were kind of wondering, is Chubb going to be as good this year? Because Hunt, he really could carve out a bigger role. He got a big contract extension, but now it's a little bit unclear, like what the workload is going to be for Chubb. So let's just start there because you mentioned that you're thinking about taking the captain and trying to take a stand here. Is there one of the two guys, or do you just think that no one's going to be going to either guy, so it's worth taking shots on both?
Yeah, I think it's worth taking shots on both. I think it just depends on how you would approach like the game total essentially, or at least the spread, because we saw last week it was the Ravens absolutely lit them up. Hunt ends up leading the team in both carries and running back targets. So I think if you want to play it as a contrarian, the Bengals end up beating up the Browns. You can run a Bengal stack and run it back with Hunt. And if you play it as the Browns, even like their spread right now is pretty large, but if you play it as they cover this spread, then you would probably be leaning Chubb. I don't feel confident about the Browns right now against the spread, so I think I could talk myself into maybe going a lot of Chubb. Maybe that doesn't make him a great captain necessarily because you would have the Bengals scoring a lot, but I think it just depends how you approach the game script. I'll have a lot of Browns onslaught with Chubb and captain, and then maybe run back some Kareem Hunt, but he's not captain there.
Nice. Yeah. So Hunt, he's pretty clearly the guy that's going to get more of the work in a bad game script for the Browns rushing game. So that makes a lot of sense to pair him with more Bengals players. I am a little hesitant on Chubb, but like I feel like maybe people are expecting his role to be a little bit bigger than it will be this season, just based on how like good he was last year. But still, like the fact that he gets so many of the yards in the ground, I think he makes a good captain, as you're saying, because one of the things we always talk about is those rushing TDs don't get split between multiple players, so it makes it more likely you get the guy who gets the most points in captain. On my top single game plays, I have him as a 13% chance of being the top scoring player compared to 9% ownership. So that makes a lot of sense. Now, I know like people like to pick quarterbacks in the captain spot, and we talked about this last week, but I thought you made a good point in the article about how maybe Joe Burrow could be a better captain than Baker. Um, so do you really want to target like those guys that rush a little bit in captain if you're picking a quarterback to begin with?
Yeah, captain wasn't incredibly like it wasn't like a dominant way to get the right captain. But the most common trend among captains who, successful quarterback captains, was they added some rushing ability. They didn't always have to be Lamar Jackson, but really it ties back into what you say. What makes running back such a special captain is that they can obviously score without rising up their opponents in a sense of you're trying to vie for a solo captain essentially. So rushing quarterbacks was really the key to making a difference at being the correct captain choice. I don't see Baker Mayfield adding really much of any captain potential because he doesn't have much rushing upside. Whereas Joe Burrow, we saw like the touchdown was on a specific design run. It was that QB draw. And he also ran particularly well in college. Like that goes underrated in his profile because he was such a good passer that final season. But the guy has wheels. Like it kind of reminds me of the way we see maybe like Russell Wilson or Dak Prescott right now. They're not Kyler Murray, but all he has to do is punch in one touchdown and throw for 2 more and spread those 2 out. And that's his path to being the right captain choice. So I can't imagine really getting into much, if any, Baker Mayfield captain. Whereas Joe Burrow, at least there is some viability to it, I think.
Definitely. I think it's a really good point because if you just look at projections, I have Joe Burrow at 17.8 and Baker Mayfield at 17.5. But like because a lot of times Baker has a good game, Odell Beckham and
Hmm.
Landry are there. It's because they like did well. Like just having that ability to get one or two extra points on the ground, which I mean I think we can count on Joe Burrow for more than that. But like even having like a little bit of upside, that just increases that chance of being the top scoring player that much more. So, what about the rest of the guys? Are there any other guys that maybe you think would be a good captain that stand out from the crowd?
Yeah, I think AJ Green has kind of separated himself. Really, it's one game; he hasn't separated himself, but I think he has a decent amount of separation as his team's lead receiver, led the team in targets and air yards, I believe. So he's a guy who makes some sense. I'd like to point out John Ross. I believe he was second on his team in targets and air yards. So for me, he has the sort of Darius Slayton mold where he's going to be a relatively low owned. He's actually, we haven't projected as like no captain ownership, and he has a decent chance of being like, we saw last year. He had a 150-yard game and I think like 112 or 20-yard game to start off the season. He can do that in one or two plays. So I think for him being, essentially an unused captain, he has a small chance, but it's a chance of being the right spot at captain. I think that's just a small EV edge you can grind out if you get a few of your lineups with John Ross as your captain.
I really like it. I think John Ross is a buy low as well because, as you're saying, like he had the air yards on Sunday's game, and the snap count was the highest of all the wide receivers, I believe. Going into the season, I was kind of low on John Ross because I'm like, how does he really fit into the team now that they drafted T Higgins? They had AJ Green coming back from injury, and the draft season long community was pretty low on John Ross, but snap counts don't lie. So you got that 80% of the snaps in week one. I'm expecting it this week. Last season, he averaged 60 yards a game over a limited sample size, but he was really good. So I think he might not be that as good with AJ Green back, but I think he'll still be really really solid, and he'll probably be the highest scoring Bengal at least one game this season. We are sponsored by No House Advantage. So it's a new DFS site where you actually bet props instead of building lineups. So if you like betting props, it's a really good way to do it because like usually you're betting against the house. On No House Advantage, you're betting against just other people, your average Joe Schmoes. And it's a lot easier to beat those guys in my experience. You pick five props, um, and whoever gets the most right wins the prizes, and you can get $20 free if you use the promo code Awesemo. I definitely I don't mind a little bit of extra Andrew Jacksons in my pocket, so make sure to take advantage of that free 20 using promo code Awesemo. So actually that leads into our next thing, our favorite prop bet, and mine I'll just lead it off because it's also with John Ross. The prop bet on No House Advantage, and I also bet a bunch of money on this on another site. Uh, his prop was like 30.5 receiving yards over under. And I'm like, how the heck did they come up with this number? Because he averaged 66 last year and he played 80% of the snaps week one. If you assume that Joe Burrow's throwing for like 250 about, then I feel like John Ross is more like a 40 or 50 at the very least. So I bet on that. Feel free to tail my bet there. Kyle, what prop are you looking at tonight?
Yeah, we have. I mean, you can check it out on Awesemo.com. We have our projections tailored to like a set of projections tailored to No House Advantage props, and our best, or I think it's like second or third best of the week. I'll give away a little bit of the goods. We have Baker Mayfield throwing one interception far more often than his prop would suggest of 0.5. We have a lot of anti-Baker in our projections, but that is the one that we have him doing way more often than the prop would expect. So I'm short Baker tonight because that is we have a lot of anti-Baker advantages on No House Advantage right now. A lot of them.
Yeah, betting those interception props on No Loss Advantage makes a lot of sense because they don't have like the odds on the over or under. And usually when you bet one of these point 0.5 interception props on a
Mhm.
sports book, it's usually like minus 175 or something on the over. This is far more likely to happen over than them throwing zero interceptions. unless you got like a really good quarterback. So those are some good ones. Um, let's tackle the Bengals here. So they got some bad luck at the end of their game on Sunday, to say the least. And they had their game-winning touchdown called back due to offensive pass interference. It was the worst, man. I had AJ Green and Joe Burrow stacked up. I would have won my GPP. And then if they made overtime and Randy Bullock hit his kick, then I could have won too. And I'm not expecting any sympathy here. So it was just kind of tilting. I'm sure a lot of guys had that same experience, but what did you make of this game they had versus the Chargers?
Yeah, I've got a similar tilting experience. I had a lot of Kyler, and I'm pretty sure he kneeled twice out of the freaking shotgun and lost the 100-yard
Oh,
bonus. Who
man.
kneels out of the shotgun? But yeah, the Bengals game. My biggest takeaway we touched on was the well, I guess I have two. The Joe Burrow rushing was sick. He is going to be a legitimate rushing threat in the NFL. Man, Joe Mixon's still not a 3-down back. I don't think maybe never we're going to see Joe Mixon as really being like not even Saquon Barkley, but not like Dalvin Cook even as a receiver. Aaron Jones, I'd probably take him over him as a receiver. We're going to see some Giovanni Bernard. Like that will be a thing we see this year. And on this slate, I think it makes like two running backs isn't a bad strategy. I did point out in my Showdown article that it's typically like your normal price running back and then a cheap option, which is why I'd look to, if you wanted to do two running back, definitely look to go Joe Mixon and then Giovanni Bernard for a few catches, as opposed to trying to, you really need a decent amount of points out of both Browns backs, whereas Giovanni Bernard doesn't have to give you that much to enter the optimal lineup. So if I'm going two backs on this slate, it makes sense for me to pay down for Gio, then up for Mixon, as opposed to try and like double middle with the Browns. And Gio clearly has a role as a pass catcher, especially if the spread is right. That could be a role we see come to full fruition tonight.
Yeah, he had some decent usage in game one. He got 5 targets. He ran routes on 26% of plays, which that's about what you'd expect from a third down back. So he's going to be on the field for those passing plays. Mixon actually ran routes on 38% of the snaps, only targeted twice. So we know he's not really a guy you can count on for a lot of receptions. So Giovanni Bernard, when they have those passing downs, makes the field, and he has that upside. So I think he could be a sleeper. Um, we had a inactive earlier that I want to mention. Auden Tate was inactive for the Bengals, which was surprising because they talked him up all year in preseason, like being the next big thing. Apparently not today. So we have pretty consistent snaps for John Ross, Tyler Boyd, and AJ Green. Tyler Boyd played 88% of the passing downs, John Ross 84, and AJ Green 68. Do you have any lean between those three guys?
Yeah, for me, Tyler Boyd was a guy who thrived on targets last year. That was his thing. He wasn't a touchdown scorer. He wasn't making giant splash plays. He just got a ton of targets. And he's like, I like him as a player. But when now you have AJ Green in the fray, a healthy John Ross, it seems like his value like quickly dissipates like that because he was so reliant as a volume player. So I think Tyler Boyd is a guy I'm probably going to be lower on, especially to you and I both liking a lot of Ross. I think AJ Green still probably has a lot of upside. I don't know. He's probably not peak AJ Green, but he's a guy who probably has a lot of weekly upside. I think that puts Tyler Boyd in the middle, and that is not a place I want him to be. I think he's going to be a mediocre efficiency player who doesn't get the targets required. Whereas last year he did get the targets required, so he did have some big games and had a consistent role. This season, as long as they have their healthy setup, I don't really see him being able to produce big, showdown winning type of weeks. Really, I mean, it'll happen, but I don't think it's something I project I'd be under the field on him.
Boyd is definitely a low hype player, yeah, because I mean, AJ Green has this long track record of being an elite receiver. Of course, he missed last year, so we're all like, what's it going to be like now? Um, I saw Laffy posting on Twitter. It's like AJ Green is like still elite. Changed my mind. I'm kind of thinking like based on the fact that AJ Green got 9 targets last on Sunday, he's going to be the most popular pick of the bunch, at least all things considered. So, how do you feel about AJ Green? Is he going to be a core part of your strategy tonight, or do you think that the hype's a little bit out of control?
I don't think the hype is necessarily out of control, but I do think it's probably just my John Ross love that I think John Ross is definitely a player I'm going to be most over the field on. I don't think AJ Green is a bad play, like you said, 9 targets last week, and I don't think they're at least more fantasy valuable targets than a guy like Tyler Boyd would be. So I would probably rank them in terms of my relativity to the field. John Ross would be my first guy, and his price is so much cheaper than the other guys. Then AJ Green, then Tyler Boyd. Are you where do you fall in the Tyler Boyd AJ Green spectrum? Because we both seem to like John Ross, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely like John Ross. Tyler Boyd, I think he's someone I have sprinkled in. Like as you said, he's not really a high percentage play because we can't really count on the targets quite as much um, with AJ Green coming back, and he never was really like exceptional even without AJ Green. So not someone I love. He's probably lost me a bunch of money, but I'm hoping that maybe people just don't like clicking that name. AJ Green is someone I have a bunch of too. I mean, it's Showdown, so honestly, I have everyone. But AJ Green, I think, is he's. I'm not expecting him to be as elite as he was a few years ago. In that 69% snap count on running passing plays last Sunday, that was underwhelming. I mean, usually when you have a spend up wide receiver, you want them to be on the field like 85% of the time, but this is a showdown game, so it doesn't really matter, to be honest. So I think they're all good options. We'll talk about the stack rules in a second, but let's talk about with Alden Tate out. Last week we saw T. Higgins, Alec Erickson, and Mike Thomas all see the field, which was really surprising that they ran 6 wide receivers out there in a close game. But do you think Alden Tate being out is going to make anyone pop, or like I don't honestly, like I probably wouldn't pick any of these guys except maybe if you're in one of these 100K person fields. But do you have any sleepers from the wide receivers you're looking at?
Yeah, Mike Thomas is a guy who we have like these 200 guys. They don't need to do a ton. Although I don't really, again, maybe it's my John Ross love. I also think that defenses are probably much more in play here than I think in other showdown slates. So I'm not sure you really need to get down to these guys. And maybe we'll talk about them in a little bit. But there are some Browns, 200, 400 plays that I actually think are probably a lot better. I think the 3 receiver set is mostly in place with Ross, Green, and Boyd, and then maybe some T. Higgins sprinkled in. So I'm not super into these guys, but like you said, everyone's at least in play, given that it's showdown. You just want to build unique lineups. Maybe Mike Thomas at 200 is probably the way I'd go, but he's just got a good value protection. You can jam in a lot of studs after that.
Yeah, I was really surprised that Mike Thomas, like, he wasn't even in my spreadsheet. I'm like, who the heck is this guy? But he got 3 targets week 1, 20% of the snap count, 22%, I should say. And Alden Tate saw 20%. So I'm thinking that's maybe a few snaps that could go to Mike Thomas potentially. So I think not a crazy guy. I don't think many people know who he is. So I think he won't be really popular. Maybe he can take a shot there. Let's talk about the tight ends here. I've been seeing people like talk about CJ Uzoma like a bunch on Twitter. Like they're like, "How is this guy only drafted in the 20th round or something?" I'm like, "Why are people talking about this?" Like maybe you can give us some insight about why CJ Uzoma is trending all of a sudden.
I mean, he had like a solid first week, but at his price at 5,000, I don't think like he's a guy who you'd see at 1,000 and say like, oh, that's a good showdown play. He's 5,000. He's right in the middle. He had a decent first week, got a handful of targets, but I'm not really sure why people are that interested in him. Maybe it's just a season-long aspect where it's like, oh, you can get a few targets every week with CJ Uzoma, but I'm not really looking to him in Showdown. We don't have him projected as a great value because he's actually priced reasonably. He's projected as a terrible value because he's priced like he should be, or at least a little overpriced even. So I don't have much interest in him. I know I think Drew Sample got 1 target. He's mostly an inline blocker, and I think there are a lot of considerable guys below $1,000. If I'm going down, I'm probably not going to Drew Sample because they took him like purely as a blocker. He gets, I think, 1 target in week 1 or maybe 2. So he's fine. I think it's worth considering, but there are some guys I actually think have like solid projections and in that range. And Drew Sample, I think like his ceiling is literally like 2 targets.
Yeah, I agree. I think Sample he's in play because anyone that has like a touchdown upside, which basically means like they're on the field. is kind of like worth considering, as you're saying. But yeah, as you're saying, like there's a lot better options on the Browns at this price range. Drew Sample is showing 1.7 fantasy points per game on the draft page, so maybe that would dissuade people from picking him. Let's talk about the defense a little bit. I think that it's definitely in play for this game more than usual to have defense even as a captain, but definitely in your roster. But do you think this is a good matchup for the Bengals D?
Based on the way Baker looked and his propensity to take sacks, and throw interceptions too, I do think this is a good matchup for the Bengals. I also don't think it's probably not bad for the Browns either. But yeah, and I don't like playing cap. It feels gross playing defense in captain. But I think this is a slate where it actually has some efficacy. You could see either of these guys, especially Baker Mayfield, just absolutely collapse under pressure, take a handful of sacks, and we know that sacks are going to at least have a chance, and pressures have a chance to lead to either errant throws that are interceptions or sack fumbles. And really, for your defense to pop off, you probably want them to score a touchdown. It's not a necessity, but that's what you'd like. And I think guys who are, maybe more risk taking, like a Baker Mayfield, and I don't know, maybe not that good, is where you'd want to play a defense in captain. So I think it's possible that it works out in captain, and it's definitely possible that this is the move just in your flex spot. So I think you're going to see, like, I don't think many people are going to be on the Bengals given the spread, but I could very much see this just being a bad line. It's early in the season. We didn't have any preseason to show off these teams, and the Browns looked absolutely dreadful. Even when Baker Mayfield was given a clean pocket, he just wasn't hitting his tight window throws, wasn't able to connect with Odell deep. So I think the Bengals defense could probably go underowned in a spot where they could just beat up on what turns out to be a bad quarterback in hindsight.
Definitely, yeah. I think that the Browns offensive line, they haven't really shown anything yet, so like targeting them to maybe give up some sacks makes a lot of sense. And the way you get defensive touchdowns is through sacks and through interceptions. So the more of those there are, the better chances that you get those. And the, I think the defense is also like correlated negatively with the rest of the game too. So like it's kind of a spot where maybe the projection doesn't, it underemphasizes like the value of defense in your lineup. So I'm getting a ton of defense, definitely over kicker today. And we got to talk about the kicker on this team, because he missed a chip shot for overtime on Sunday, Randy Bullock. I mean, I don't think that really affects my process at all. Like, I still kind of like kickers a little bit, but not a lot. But what's your take on Randy today?
So it's a weird situation. They signed Austin Seibert, Browns kicker, who was cut for also kicking like absolute trash in week one. They signed him, and I believe he is on the active roster for this game. But I saw somewhere that Zach Taylor said he won't be getting in, so maybe he's not on the active roster. But I don't think that affects anything, although it is borderline hilarious that they pick up Austin Seibert right after he gets cut by the Browns. Yeah, Bullock, I don't know. It's such a I don't want to say random because maybe he's not a good kicker, but it was just a bad time to miss a kick. I think that'll stick out. Kickers are fine, especially in a game with a lower total. You don't need them like typically in high totals. You either need a team to struggle in the red zone and just kick a lot of field goals. You need like a fast-paced game that ends at the 30-yard line, or you need a low total game where points are at a premium. Just getting 2 to 3 field goals is the successful end of the outcomes. This could be a game with not a lot of scoring. So I think kickers, kind of like defenses, are more in play, but I'm still not going to be going crazy on either of the kickers.
That's probably wise. Yeah, I think that kicker is solid for value. Definitely something that makes a lot of sense in cash, because like you get consistent scoring. But I have noticed they aren't quite as good values as maybe they were in previous years. Bullock's 4,200. That's just average. So I might go with defense over kicker today. Um, all right, guys, we're talking about all these tools, but you definitely need to get access to them as well, because like there's so much money in these DFS tournaments that not really taking full advantage of the resources out there is going to be a leak. So you gotta leverage all the projections. We got ownership projections, the top stacks tool, the top showdown plays tool. Like these are really how I get my advantage, is figuring out the probabilities, because these days like everyone knows the projections. It's all about how you leverage those to make your lineups, and you have to know the probability. What's the chance that each team is going to be the highest scoring stack? What's the chance that Joe Mixon is the highest scoring player? And we also got a lot of great premium written content as well. So make sure to check all those out. Let's talk about the Browns here. Now they had an abysmal Sunday as well, but a tougher matchup versus the Ravens. They just like couldn't get it going at all though. So I know you've been kind of down on Baker. What did you make of that game?
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult matchup, but like I said, he was skittish in the pocket. Like anytime they even got a remote amount of pressure, he looked terrible. He was immediately rolling out. He took this back-breaking sack to I think Tyus Bowser, where he just backpedals and watches pressure come into his face and just takes the sack. It's one game though. It is one game. Baker Mayfield was a killer in college. He had a great rookie season in the NFL despite playing on a trash Browns team. So I think we have him projected as a like a he's going to be kind of high owned and captain. And like I said, I don't, for him, he doesn't really have like a high rushing ceiling for me. So I would only consider him in flex. I think there's some efficacy to, the Bengals defense isn't particularly stout either. The Browns are big favorites. So, and there's some good value on the slate. So I think it's easy to get up to at least one quarterback for sure. So I think he's in play, but I'm not going to go crazy on him. And I'm not really going to be big on him in captain either.
I agree. I think one of the smartest moves you can make on this slate is not picking Baker at captain. Like, of course, like taking a stand this hard, like surely, at least if it doesn't work out, you can blame me for telling you to do this, and then you won't have to blame yourself. So I'm not on Baker and the captain like you're saying because I feel like it's more likely that Odell and Jarvis Landry, whichever one has a big night, if Baker's in the winning lineup, will outscore him. So that's the way I'm leaning. On FanDuel, it's different. I'll mention that because 0.5 PPR does increase the chance of a quarterback being the highest scoring play significantly. And let me bring up the single game plays here just to give you an idea of that. On DraftKings, Baker, I have a 7% chance of being the highest scorer. On FanDuel, is double that, 14%. And that really shows the power of quarterbacks on FanDuel. Of course, they're also really high owned on FanDuel, so people realize that. But if we're not picking a Baker a captain, I'm assuming if you have Odell or Landry in the captain spot, are you going to pick Baker in the flex?
Yeah, I don't think it's mandatory specifically because specifically on DK where you get PPR value and you can get that 100-yard bonus even if Baker doesn't hit 300. Odell could hit 100, but I would I'd key boost Baker as a guy who he does like we saw if he doesn't play well, Odell is just drawing up dead, especially because Odell is going to have a deeper ADOT and those are more difficult throws to make. If Baker isn't playing well, he is just not going to hit him. And I do think Odell's week one is a bit overrated in how bad it was. He was only 3 of 10 on his targets, and I think he goes for 22 yards. He did have 3 targets that get counted as targets where he drew a penalty. Those are successful plays in the eyes of NFL success, but he probably ends up catching some of those passes if he doesn't get, if his opponent doesn't get penalized while defending him. So against, maybe a weaker secondary, he is able to get something going. I like him, and I would emphasize getting Baker in, but I don't think it is mandatory specifically because of the target concentration. They have like a clear 2 top receivers in Odell and Jarvis Landry. It's not like Baker is going to throw, 4 touchdowns to a bunch of different guys and basically be a guaranteed captain if Odell goes off. Odell could just have a good volume game, and the same with Jarvis Landry. They could just get a lot of volume, a lot of PPR points, and Baker not necessarily be captain, but it is highly likely that he is the captain when they end up being, or that he's in the flex spot when they do end up being the best captain play. So it would be not a 100% rule that you have to have him if you have, Odell, Jarvis, and captain, but it is much more likely that he is a good flex play in that scenario.
I agree completely. I mean, the odds of picking a player in the winning lineup are pretty low to begin with. So when you have a correlated player in your lineup at captain in particular, it does really improve your odds of hitting all 6 plays because it's hard to just pick 6 random players and get there. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, pretty good chance that the whole team doesn't get there as well. So definitely not having him in all lineups or anything. But let's go through the Browns players because I know there were some that you're mentioning might be sleepers today. Odell and Landry played at about 80% of the snaps. Odell got 10 targets, Landry got 6. You mentioned those penalties, like those probably didn't even make the box score too, so it's worth considering. Is Odell going to be your top choice over Landry, or do you think it's closer than people think?
I think it's close. Let me look at our ownership projections, see who we have. Odell as they're not too far apart actually. They're basically the same. I think Odell has a really good points per dollar projection as well. And I think he has a lot more like explosive play upside because he does run deeper. So I'm pretty big on Odell and captain this week on DK. Obviously, he's a guy who I'm prioritizing getting into captain. I'm not ruling Jarvis Landry out either, though. And I think maybe one way I've been thinking that you could play either Landry or Boyd is there guys who would seem to be successful in games where they're losing a lot because you want your team to be passing and you want them to basically just be trying to like run 2-minute drills. So that's where Jarvis Landry on the Browns side being a slot receiver who could just catch a lot of dump offs on drives where they're just trying to put yards together, and Boyd on the Bengals side could be successful. So I think it's maybe interesting to go if you wanted a Bengals onslaught. That's probably a scenario where I think Jarvis Landry is a bit more viable. Otherwise, I am much more in favor of Odell Beckham. Jarvis Landry, not a bad play, but I think Beckham is probably a really good play tonight.
Yeah, I think Beckham's a good play as well. Like, I'm thinking that Odell Beckham is his first year on the Browns. Last year, there has been a trend that first-year receivers on new teams underperform a little bit. He got way more targets than Landry last week, so that kind of bears it out to some extent. So I think Odell is kind of clearly a little bit better than Landry at least. Now Landry, he on a per game basis, like basically like competed with Odell last year. So I think that Landry may be a little underrated. Just like Odell is a little overrated just based on the name value. So that's kind of the way I'm leaning here. Their third receiver was Cotterell Hodge. He's dirt cheap tonight. So I'm guessing he's one of those guys you like as one of those value plays.
Yeah, there are two like crazy value plays, like a number 3 receiver, like a starting receiver on an offense. Cotterell Hodge, a guy who I believe saw like 2 or 3 targets last week, caught one of them, and still ends up being just 400. We have him as one of the best values. And one other guy I'll throw out there, Harrison Bryant. The Browns ran 2 or even 3 personnel in over 20 snaps last week. And Harrison Bryant, now that David Njoku is on IR, is going to be the number 2 tight end on a team that wants to run 2 tight end. And we saw Kevin Stefanski when he was with the Vikings, ran a lot of 2 tight end. He's not a starting player, but for 200, a guy who could get in, especially if we saw them run, I think it was a 3 tight end set, the one Njoku scored on a busted coverage in the back of the end zone. Like Harrison Bryant, out of, we talk about anybody who has touchdown upside, just get on the field for a few snaps. I would say Harrison Bryant, more than any of these other cheap players, actually has legitimate touchdown, 2 to 3 catch and touchdown upside. It's like he's basically just, we should view him like we viewed, or like we, view in hindsight, David Njoku last week. Njoku goes, I believe, 3 for 54 and a touchdown, has a long play that he catches, and then a kind of a busted coverage on a weird, cool set, 3 tight ends in the back of the end zone, was completely uncovered. That could be Harrison Bryant this week. And for 200, that's crazy cheap. So I'd probably prioritize going Bryant over Hodge, but these are both guys that are just like massive misprices, just complete whiffs by the DraftKings pricing.
Definitely. Hodge made my cash lineup. I think he's just like obviously like a terrific play. It was funny. I was like tweeting about Cotterell Hodge last year, and he like responded himself to my tweet.
What?
Yeah, I know. Like it made my season. So I have a rooting interest for him. He was like, you don't know who I am, like you will soon or something. So
We will tonight.
yeah. Harrison Bryant, I think, is also a good option. Like as you said, it's just the snaps. Like he played 31 of 74 snaps. He only blocked on passing downs once out of 17 passing downs he was in on, which is a really good sign that he's going to be running routes. So I think that he makes a lot of sense. They also have this guy, Steven Carlson. There was a report that he would be the tight end 3, kind of sliding in with Njoku being injured. Honestly, like it might be a little bit too far off the board. Do you have any take on Steven Carlson? He played 13 snaps last week.
Yeah, I'm just going. Harrison Bryant is as deep as I go because I think Harrison Bryant actually could have a role as the number 2 tight end. It would be not absolutely flooring, but it would be surprising to see him basically outproduce Bryant or even Hodge. Both of those guys, I think, are the same price. I don't feel the need to go to Carlson.
Yeah, I agree. I don't try to get too cute in these tournaments. I think if I was trying to pick someone just totally off the board, like Carlson might fit the bill. But as you're saying, Bryant's already going to kind of be low owned, so there's not much value. Let's talk about Austin Hooper because people had high expectations for him after the season in Atlanta last year. He played 31 of 48 snaps last week. He only saw 2 targets. Now, that was only 6% target share when he was on the field, which is way lower than we're going to expect going forward. Do you think people are going to be down on Hooper because of his bad week last week?
Yeah, I think he's a decent flex play. I don't love him as a projections play, but when you look at his ownership, he's going to have pretty modest ownership. He's a guy who I think especially makes sense in Baker stacks, specifically because he's like clearly a third option. You do in some sense probably need a very solid game from Baker for it actually to trickle down for a guy like Austin Hooper to hit. So Hooper, not a guy I'm particularly high on. I think the 2 tight end sets basically competing with another player at his own position would worry me a little bit. So Hooper, not a guy I love as a projection play, but the ownership is low and we're looking to build different unique lineups. So that puts him definitely in my player pool. I'm not going to be super crazy on him, but he's at least worth considering. And you said it like, yeah, the ownership or the target share was low. I don't expect it to be that low. They paid up for him in free agency. Kevin Stefanski is a guy who utilizes his tight ends. So I think he should be at least on the upswing from a very boring week 1.
Yeah, I kind of like it. On the site, I actually give my projections for each player's stat line. So those can be used to bet and also to help really dive deep into how everyone is projected to do. So I'm pulling up my projection for Hooper here. Got him for 42 yards. That's still, I mean, that's a lot less than he averaged last year, but that's still enough to maybe crack the top scoring play on a good night for him. So I'm definitely keeping him in mind when I'm building lineups tonight. So all right, so we talked a little bit about the running backs. I'll throw out one other name I've heard people talk about, D'Ernest Johnson. I mean, I think he was just in because it was a blowout. Like, would you ever like roster that guy?
No, we have so many better of the punt plays. You know, he's even like 1,000. He's not like the awesome punt play level that I think you and I feel about Hodge and Bryant, one or the other. I would rather go to those guys. He's more on that. Like he's kind of in the Steven Carlson range where like, I don't know, I guess if you're playing the largest field and you want to have a single used lineup, a perfectly unique lineup, sure you go to D'Ernest Johnson, but like I'm gonna leave him on whatever AAF roster he played on because I'm pretty sure he played in the AAF.
Yeah, I wanted to throw all these names out there just to sound smart. So I apologize, I guys. Just to disregard like Carlson and D'Ernest Johnson, because like if you're going down that far, first of all, like this slay's really interesting because as you mentioned, they're really good plays at 200 and 300, which is like very
There are a lot of good plays at that price, which is crazy. It hardly happens. Like a lot of games don't have one, and this has multiple of them.
definitely. So that would be wild. I think that we'll see some stacked lineups. Maybe try not to over optimize and avoid that range could be a unique build this week just because it's so stacked. I'm sure a lot of optimizers will put people on them. And actually that's the way I've been going with my lineups a lot is my value will be like the defense or kicker. And then I'll like kind of pack it with studs. So that is one build I'm going for this week. It's for the Browns D, I mean, Joe Burrow, he doesn't have a long sample in the NFL, but Cincinnati's uh, offensive line last year was dreadful. So I'm thinking maybe like there could be a lot of sack and interception potential here. What do you think?
Yeah, Myles Garrett last year before he gets suspended averaged a single sack a game alone. Like it was one guy, a one-man wrecking crew back in the fold now against Joe Burrow. And not only, is our sample small, but we do know that running quarterbacks can tend to take significantly more sacks. We see it with a guy like Kyler Murray, who I love Kyler Murray, but the way he moves around the pocket, he walks into a lot of defenders. So Joe Burrow being a guy who moves in the pocket a lot, it's valuable, but it also could lead him to taking a decent amount of sacks against a defensive line that we know has a lot of top end talent in Myles Garrett. So yeah, I actually think the Browns defense is a very interesting play. I think maybe you talk about we're going to get like optimizers just absolutely crushing the Hodge and the Bryant lineups. I think one way that you have to consider going with those guys is just leaving a lot of cap on the table when you play those guys, because a lot of people are going to try and min max go one cheap guy and just jam in the rest of the high price guys. you could just say it's kind of a junk game where no one hits big. So you can go with like a Hodge who say he goes like 3 for 50 or whatever, and then the game's boring elsewhere. Then you don't have to spend all your caps. Maybe that's another way. You talked about like potentially fading those guys in large field tournaments, of course. Maybe if you're going with those guys, another way to do it is you go with them, but you don't go the chalk elsewhere, at least not every single chalk play.
Yeah, and another idea that came in my head, I think those are good points. Also, like if you go for a Hodge, maybe you leave money on the table because everyone's going down to Hodge because they're trying to cram in all the other players. He like could possibly score 10 plus points. It's like not that unlikely. And if you leave money on the table with that build, maybe he'll outscore the defense and kicker. He'll get you the win. So that is one option to just get a little sneaky. I don't leave a ton of money on the board in NFL usually, but that is one way to go down to that range and be unique. But let's look at the ownership projections on these guys because maybe it's not even worth worrying about. Hodge is at 5% projected ownership. Bryant's at 4.6%. And then the other guys that are in this range, Sample 3%, Thomas 3%. So based on this, I'm guessing you like Bryant and Hodge the best.
Yeah, given that their ownership is so low, it doesn't seem like you need to pivot off. Like it's not like, Drew Sample becomes such a great pivot when they're all going to be low owned. I'm just going to take the better projection, assuming that the ownership is even close to right. It's actually crazy that these guys project so well and are not going to be like that crazy, not going to be very owned at all. So yeah, it doesn't seem like you need to get too crazy, like, go that far left field when you play guys like Bryant or Hodge, both of whom are my favorite punt plays in this range. Because yeah, it just doesn't seem like people are quite as keen to them as we seem to be. So yeah, I don't think you have to get too galaxy brain with how you play these guys.
Definitely, yeah. So, one indication of why this is Cotterell Hodge has only averaged 2.2 points a game over his first game, so he only got 2.2 points. So maybe it's like it's an obvious play because we looked at the snap count, but most people aren't going to be looking at that, so they're not going to land on Hodge. They're not going to land on Bryant. It's going to be a little bit like too far for most people. So I think that they could be really good ways to complete your lineup. Let's circle back a little bit. Let's talk about stacks because we didn't really talk about that a ton. My general rule in Showdown is if you have a passing QB like Baker, if you have them as captain, you want 2 receivers from the team. If you have Burrow, because he has that rushing upside, maybe you only need 1. What's your take on how you stack these guys up?
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I would set those same types of rules as well. And when I looked at the previous winning lineups of a year of data, it's exactly how it panned out. When there was running quarterbacks, you didn't have to have multiple of their pass catchers. The pure passing quarterbacks, they just got there by spreading the ball out. Like on games, it's a bit random. If they happen to throw a touchdown to 3 different guys, that's how they got there. So yeah, with a guy who I don't think really has almost any like real high end rushing upside with Baker Mayfield, I think you have to play 2 of his receivers. And even at captain, I think you have to boost when you play a receiver at captain. You have to boost his quarterbacks. That was very common. It wasn't a 100% rule, but it was very common. So both ways. It goes both directions. Quarterbacks, they need a lot of receivers. Receivers, they typically need their quarterback.
Yeah, I like it. I think that you definitely like taking into account the type of quarterback you got. So, we got a super chat from that trap guy. Thanks for or that rap guy. My bad. Your opinion
It's
on
like the same
CJ.
thing.
Your opinion on CJ Uzoma for Cincinnati. Will he get 5 targets? I'm down on him because I feel like he was on the field a lot last year and he only got targeted like a small amount. But he's got the playing time. Is he someone you feel comfortable with in your rosters?
Yeah, like I think it's like you said, he's a guy who it seems like his role is just to be out there. He's not a guy they're going to target a lot. So despite the fact that he has this moniker as a number 1 tight end, and maybe that gets you onto him, I don't think you really need to have him. Like it's not like you're gaining a ton of leverage by not playing him. But I would say I'm kind of with you where I'm down on him. I think he's mostly just a blocker, a guy who could he can pick up 5 targets in a game like we saw, but he's not like an explosive playmaker. He's not like a downfield tight end. Like when you look at the Saints, how they use Jared Cook is pretty cool. They use him downfield a lot, or at least they did last year. Same with like a Mark Andrews. He's not that. He's not a target hog. He just doesn't check any of the boxes for a guy 1 at tight end. I don't like he should be, I don't know, he shouldn't be priced at Harrison Bryant, but he shouldn't also be like 10 times as much as him.
Yeah, I think that like I'm more like interested because there's so much hype over Uzoma, and I don't really understand it. But let's talk a little bit more about the stacking because we didn't. I mean, it's obviously a big topic. Now, you mentioned that if you have a receiver, a captain, sometimes like you're gonna take the quarterback. Sometimes maybe fade him kind of on purpose. Now, uh, if you so is like if based on that strategy, is that just kind of like you? It could be contrarian to maybe make a lineup where you don't stack it.
Yeah, it definitely could be contrarian. And I would look at guys who can basically be like massive target hogs. I wouldn't want a guy like, I wouldn't want, Tyler Boyd probably is a guy who I probably wouldn't really want. I don't think he's very likely to lead his team in targets. I think the scenario where he enters the optimal lineup is more of a Bengals onslaught. Where Odell Beckham, I think, like we saw last week, he can get 10 targets in a game. He can just overshadow anybody else on his team. So I think it's like we talk about with running quarterbacks, it's also important to know the type of receiver you have, a guy who can basically command his entire offense. So even if his offense isn't that good, he still hits. So Odell is a guy I'd do that with. If you believe that we could see peak AJ Green, which I think we could still see in spurts, he's a guy I would do it with. I'm not sure so much how I'd feel about Jarvis Landry. Is Jarvis Landry a guy you consider doing that with? I think you could argue that he can win in PPR, and obviously PPR doesn't help Baker, so maybe that's a way you get to him and do it, but I'd feel more confident with Odell in that sense. How do you feel about that type of move?
It's kind of interesting because I feel like the stack is going to be really popular. People understand correlations. They usually stack in DFS. So um, maybe go into a possession receiver like Landry makes sense because, as you said, like maybe he racks up a lot of points without touchdowns. He gets 110, and like to Baker, that's only 4 points. So there's definitely potential there. But it's not like a go-to strategy. It's kind of but both quarterbacks are the two most popular guys in the slate, about 60% projected ownership. So that's worth keeping in mind. And then one of my rules is that if I have a quarterback in the flex, I don't want two receivers in the flex as well, because it's like if I have like Odell Beckham Jr., Baker, and Landry on the flex, like if both of those guys go off, then Baker is going to have a big day, right? So, like, do you have a rule like that set?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That's a rule I think you should be utilizing because yeah, like what is the scenario where they're all flex worthy, but it's like a middle that doesn't hardly exist where they're all good flex plays, but none of them reach captain levels despite the offense. Like the offense has to do well for them all three to get in there. So it's like a middle that I would say probably doesn't exist or exists at a point where it's negative EV to try and shoot for that middle. So I would absolutely go with that where you don't want to stack a team but then not use any of them in the captain.
Definitely, yeah. I think that that makes a lot of sense. So, um, you definitely want like a lineup that's going to make sense because like if you have two receivers from the same team and you don't have the quarterback, like that doesn't make a lot of sense either, right? So, um, that's definitely a rule. Now, are there any other like correlations you're targeting, like defense, kicker, or anything like that in your lineups?
So I think one that makes a lot of sense, particularly for tonight, is Nick Chubb captain and his defense, the Browns, because we saw that the Browns are going to be using Kareem Hunt if they're losing. He even the surprising thing was that he out carried Nick Chubb. I think it's not awfully surprising he got a lot of targets when they were losing. That's kind of the expectation. But I think the effect of him just being on the field when they're losing means when they audible into runs or when they're trying to, sell a pass but then run a run play, you put Kareem Hunt on the field for those plays. So you kind of have to have, or at least it is most likely, that the Browns, if they are beating up on the Bengals, that is a Nick Chubb scenario. And I think that happens if their defense plays well. So I would really be keen on if I have Nick Chubb as my captain, it probably means the Browns are really, really shutting down the Bengals offense. So Browns defense in the flex, or you could probably even run it the other way too. If the Browns defense scores a touchdown, Nick Chubb could have a good game, but it lets you get a lot of Browns onslaught type of value. So either way, I think both of those guys make sense in tandem, guys, as the Browns as a guy.
Yeah, like I think that Kareem Hunt is a run back to the Bengals stack, like you were suggesting earlier, and then Chubb and the defense makes a lot of sense because rushing yards tend to accumulate a lot when a team's up big. So having that situation where you get that extra few points that the other team didn't score many points, that could be enough to bring the Browns defense from like 4 to 8 points or something, and put them in the optimal. So I think in a low scoring fantasy game, having that running back defense correlation makes a lot of sense. So we got 3 minutes left. I'm sure everyone is scrambling to put their last lineups together. Do you guys have, or I mean, Kyle, do you have any final thoughts here for the slate?
Yeah, I think for me, given I'm so surprised at the low ownership we're getting with the really cheap guys, is I don't know if I'm making them foundational plays, but I want to be over the field on these guys because I think they're not just guys who project as good values. I think there is legitimate upside in the sense of they can make the optimal lineup. They could have made the optimal lineup even if they were like $1,000. The fact that they're 2,400 is just even better. But there are guys like Kadarius Hodge is like a legitimate number 3 receiver. Harrison Bryant is a legitimate number 2 tight end on a team that we saw wants to run 2 and even 3 tight end sets. So these are guys who I think project as great values, even if you had priced them up to 500, 6, 7, 800, 1,000, whatever. Even if they had been higher priced, I'd still be on them. The fact that they really let me jam in a lot of good players and they're not going to cost me ownership, it's not going to make me go super duplicated or anything. They're probably guys I'm just going to be over the field on by a significant amount.
Nice, man. I think that's good advice because the big thing this week is I feel like in week 2 people are going to react a lot to the scores in week 1. Hodge, John Ross, Harrison Bryant, these are guys that did kind of poorly in week 1, and they're going to go underowned, while guys who did well in week 1 are going to be really popular tonight. Now, from these teams, that's basically no one that did well in week 1. So, I mean, it doesn't have as much weight, but I think going to Hodge or Bryant, and there are a couple other guys that could be that little like edge you need to get differentiated. So another thing, like obviously dupes are really important in these tournaments. So try not to over optimize your lineup. Like I know one of our guys, Joey, he's like, if your lineup makes too much sense, you might be doing it wrong. So like
yeah, I like that's why I agree. That's why I like maybe leaving some salary on the table with your guys like Hodge and Bryant, because I do think like the 5% of people who are playing Bryant or Hodge are probably going to have a very similar build because it literally just lets you do anything you want. So although they are low owned, they probably all of their guys owning them are doing it in a similar way. So I think maybe leaving just a little extra salary on the table with those guys, how you'd want to approach it. And yeah, you said it, John Ross. Play John Ross.
I hope he has a big game, man. That'll be fun to watch. All right, guys, we are locked. Make sure to check out No House Advantage promo code Awesemo for $20. If you like prop betting, it's definitely a way to make more money prop betting because you're playing against Joe Schmo instead of a big sports book. So that gives you a lot more edge. And hopefully we have a good game. Hopefully some of these guys that maybe people aren't expecting come out and perform well. But in any case, hopefully it's an entertaining game, and good luck, everybody.